Often our memories can help us and continue to give meaning to our lives even after a loss. So Len DeMuth will now share how this has evolved in her life.
Among the many family photographs on my piano is one of my maternal grandfather posing with his violin. Most likely taken in the early 1920s, the photo shows a handsome and very serious young man. Grandpa Sherbarth was a lifelong musician, at one time playing for the Baltimore Symphony and holding a vast collection of 78 RPM and some newer records of the great violinists of the 20th century. I have some of those records now, and one of my most prized possessions is a 90-year-old copy of the Victrola Book of the Opera, given to me by my grandparents and inscribed in my granddad's big, bold handwriting, with much love to their granddaughter. But Grandpa also was a nomad, a wanderer, never quite satisfied with his place in life. He pulled my grandmother, my mother, and my aunt from one side of the country to the other. In fact, my mom still has the list her dad created of all the places they lived. Something like 3 handwritten pages of house addresses from Maryland to California and places in between. He always was looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the greener grass on the other side of the fence. Even after Mom and Aunt Lou were grown and gone, Grandma and Grandpa moved around Southern California, finally settling for the remainder of their golden years in Chula Vista. I think, other than his wife and daughters, music was the thing that kept my grandfather grounded. I remember him sitting in his favorite chair, smoking his pipe, listening to the likes of Heifetz, Stern, and other violin greats, mostly Heifetz. When I look at that photograph now, I am grateful for the gift of music that he passed to my mother, who passed it to me. I am thankful for the memories I have of visits with my grandparents, the beautiful baby grand piano in their living room, the good meals, the hard butterscotch candies in the crystal bowl, the card games, and the quiet conversation. I'm also reminded that sometimes our pot of gold is sitting right here next to us. We just need to look for it and be grateful.
Ritual. One definition is a symbolic activity performed before, during, or after a meaningful event to achieve some desired outcome. All cultures have some kind of ritual surrounding death and mourning. Many of these rituals are associated with a specific religious tradition and are done in a prescribed way, often with a repeated sequence. But some are private, some are communal. And in a society where people are less and less tied to a traditional religion that their family had been part of for generations, some of us are left a little floundering when it comes to rituals of grief. Is this a problem? Do we need rituals? A February 2014 Journal of Experimental Psychology article discusses research that shows human beings benefit from ritual, especially in times of change and loss, and when our lives feel out of control or chaotic. The authors, Norton and Gino, suggest that there's a common psychological mechanism at work here, and that is, when there is a loss, there is often an overwhelming feeling that we aren't in control of anything anymore. Restoring a perceived sense of control, even in just 1 or 2 areas of our lives, helps with an increased sense of well-being, better physical health, and coping ability. And ritual can do that. But apparently, it doesn't matter, really, what the ritual actually is. Or even if people will believe it will work. For instance, doing a rain dance to make it rain. People might not believe that that will really help with the rain, but it helps them. The act of dancing, a ritual dance, is enough to give a feeling of being more in control. And it helps people feel better, even if the rain doesn't come. In the research study, few of the rituals were specifically religious, and most of them were actually private, ordinary rituals. But communal ones can also give the sense that we are not alone, and they can connect us to the people that came before, the people that will come after, helping us know that all human beings have gone through suffering and loss. So that's why we create rituals here in our community. There are even some instances of mourning rituals that seem contradictory, and yet both kinds can promote well-being. For instance, there are Hindu traditions that require men to shave their heads and beards during a time of mourning. And yet, there are certain Jewish sects that forbid the shaving of facial hair during mourning. And in Jewish tradition, newborn babies are often named after those who have recently died. But other cultures, it would be considered bad luck to name a child after a recently deceased family member. So, in a sense, it's not so much what we do as our intention to it. Grief rituals most frequently studied have been those related to religious practice, especially crying and prayer. Prayer has been shown to improve our ability to cope. In many cultures, crying is considered positive. Catholic tradition sees it as a sign of respect, and Turkish traditions encourage loud public crying as a way to cleanse the soul. And yet, Tibetan Buddhists consider crying to be disruptive, getting in the way of healing. And crying is sometimes easier and more acceptable for women than for men. We know many boys have been told men don't cry. Rituals are formed around the deep losses of the death of loved ones, but also in other activities of life, especially where the outcomes feel unpredictable. For instance, if you've ever played the lottery and you do it regularly, you probably know that many people have certain traditions associated with picking lottery numbers and then things they do after they inevitably lose. And people with occupations that are somewhat unpredictable, such as those who catch fish and athletes, they often develop really elaborate rituals around their work activities. If any of you have been watching the World Series, you've probably seen some of the things that people do before they bat and before the pitchers pitch. And they do the same things every time. And people develop and enjoy everyday little rituals that are often done at a certain time in a certain order, like making a cup of coffee, dressing, carefully putting on a certain piece of jewelry, making a toast at a special dinner. We all do this. And across the lifespan and across cultures, rituals help people by providing order and stability during times of disorder and change. And there are traditional societies or specific ethnic or religious groups especially that have rituals around death and grief. Think of the New Orleans jazz funeral. It starts with a brass band, and at first it's slow and mournful. And then it transitions into something joyful to celebrate life as people walk to the gravesite, even dancing to "O Win the Saints." It first started sad and then something to dance to. Last week, I was at a UU Religious Educators Annual Conference, where one of the 4 difficult topics was death. The other 3, sex, money, race, these were really easy things to tackle in one weekend. No. But the day that we were dealing with death, one of our presenters told us that she grew up in Detroit, but still was culturally very identified in many ways as African American from the southern part of the U.S. And she shared a saying that she heard frequently growing up, that death is not a reason to end a conversation, and death is especially not a reason to stop an argument. The conversations continue. Death is seen as a natural part of family and community life, and people continue their relationships with their dearly departed by frequently talking to them, frequently talking about them. Within this culture, loud and public emotional expressions of grief are usually encouraged. But other groups, say sometimes white people of Northern European descent, and sometimes some Asian ethnic groups, they're encouraged to have a more stoic attitude. So culture and how you grow up plays a big role. In the early 19th century, in New England, people in mourning were expected to wear special black garments for at least 6 months, often a year. Now, today this seems restrictive, but it protected people from the embarrassment of thoughtless remarks and having to repeatedly explain the details of the death over and over to folks who otherwise might not even know that someone had died. So those special clothes communicated the loss, and then after a significant break of time, the change back to more regular clothing signaled the beginning of a return to life for the mourners. These ancient rituals can help us move from a sense of isolation, despair, raw pain, to a place of connection, meaning, acceptance, and wholeness. Many cultures stress the sharing of meals and the sharing of stories at the time of death, and this helps. But there are few rituals in our general society today and in this country other than the actual day of the funeral or memorial service. And yet, as I've said, most people could benefit from ritual, whether communal or private. It helps us cope. So what can we do to create rituals that restore us to a feeling of more control, well-being, even peace and love? Rituals can be so many things. We can start participating in activities that our loved one relished, although some people might choose to avoid those activities because of the reminders. It really depends. We can write a letter to our loved one. We can keep it safe to reread it, or we could bury it, or float it, or even burn it, visualizing the smoke carrying a message to our special person. Some people make scrapbooks of photos, or they create shadow boxes of objects and memories. Some create works of art, or sew a quilt made out of clothing that our loved one wore. Some people celebrate with special meals on anniversary days. We light candles, we light incense, we ring chimes, things that bring us into a ritual and close it out, creating that safe space. Some people carry or wear something special that belonged to the loved one, changing a wedding ring to go onto a chain to wear underneath clothes. Some people do that as a private reminder. Rebecca Riggs has another ritual she will share with us.
As at least some of you know, I lost my 17-year-old son to suicide. If he had lived, he would be 28 now. I miss him every day. For many reasons, some of them good and some of them not so good, I returned to my job of teaching high school just 3 weeks after he died. I could function in the classroom, but coming home after spending the day around vibrant teenagers was harder than I ever imagined. I used to wonder why. I could get through a day at school just fine, but then completely fall apart and feel on the verge of a breakdown every evening. Not some evenings, not some days, every day. At some point, I realized that I needed more of an outlet for my grief than I was allowing myself. And this is where ritual helped me. The evening of the day he died, we closed Eric's bedroom door and left it closed. Finally, I decided to let myself back in to his room. Every evening after dinner, I would go upstairs, open his door, and light the candle that had been lit and extinguished during his memorial service and was now sitting on his dresser. I would find a place to simply sit. Sometimes I would sit on his bed and hold his pillow. Sometimes I would sit at his desk and look at all the things he had tacked, still there on his bulletin board. Sometimes I sat on the floor by his closet and felt and held his clothes, trying to catch his scent. Sometimes I lay on the floor and watched the candle, and sometimes I simply stared out the window. The point is, I designated a time each day just to be with him. The spirit of him that still flickered for me in that candle. Not to push thoughts of him away so that I could talk to people or drive my car or cook or try to eat. Not to hold back the pain of his loss. During that half hour each day, I had no goal except to sit with his memory, regardless of how much it hurt. I didn't allow myself all evening. I had half an hour, sometimes maybe a little more. And then I would blow out the candle, leave his room, and enter back in to my other existence. Especially in the beginning, I spent much of my time in his room in tears. But that was okay, because I wasn't fighting the urge to cry for that brief interval of time. The tears washed through me, and I found that I was coping better in other parts of my personal life. At the time, I didn't really think of it as observing a ritual, but I guess that's what it was. A time set aside to deal with what my spirit needed to deal with. I no longer go into his room for my half hour each evening. In fact, we've moved and he doesn't even have his room anymore. But I still have that candle. And when the pain and loss creeps up on me unexpectedly sometimes, I will light it and sit with that flickering light. It gives me permission to hurt. It gives me permission to heal. In its small way, it still helps.
Other rituals might be planting a tree or a garden and dedicating it to your loved one, or putting up a nest box to attract nesting birds. Some of you may not know that we have a pretty and peaceful memorial garden across the parking lot on this side, behind our staff offices. The ashes of some of our congregants who have died are there. I know most of those people, including Eric, and I like to sit there thinking of my friends. Other things we can do: keep a journal, write a poem, a song. Make a list of positive things we don't regret or are grateful for about our loved one's life. Perform simple acts of kindness in our loved one's memory or donate to one of their favorite charities. We could light and float a Chinese sky lantern in the night sky, like my family did for a dear one who had died. We could continue a project that our special person started, volunteer to help others in their memory. Many of us create a private shrine at home in a quiet corner with photos and mementos similar to this. We could write a thank you to the loved one on an anniversary day. We could visit a burial site or where the ashes are kept or strewn or buried. Sometimes it's helpful to do something to mark a ritual for the end of what feels like an old life and the beginning of what is a new life. Many of you know our former pianist Alex, and he was only 19 when he played for his first memorial service right here. I was going to let him do it because he was great on the piano. But then it occurred to me maybe he had never been to a memorial or a funeral at age 19. And it turned out that that was the case. He'd never been to one. So I decided to stay with him, and we talked about it for a while beforehand, and I said, you know, what helps me is to think of music as a safe container. Music has a beginning. It may make us cry, but then it ends. And we take a deep breath and we go on.